Our present speaker is Emeritus Professor Blair Hall from the University of Oxford, a fellow of St. Paul. Who is he? Well, all I will say is, if you were to ask yourself the question, why did Oliver Cromwell refuse to accept the offer of the crown when it was made to him? This is the man to answer that question.
Milton had equipped himself for the writing of poetry by the long years of what he called labour and intent study, which I take to be my portion in this life. He was not interested in learning for itself. It was for use as a guide to living. Milton has steeped himself in the best which had been thought and said in the world, both pagan and Christian, but to him the virtue celebrated by the Greeks and Romans was in harmony with Christian revelation. There was another point to learning. Engagement with past minds for learning was essentially the study of past thoughts and deeds, liberates the reader from the pressures of opinion which prevail in the parish of time in which we happen to live and with which Milton got so impatient. But study required peace and tranquility. He thanked his father for financing the retreat to Horton in Buckinghamshire, where in the 1630s he was able to study away from the noise and din of the city. When he got back from his journey to Italy in 1639, he hired for me and my books a house in the city, one free from noise, where he returned to his studies with delight. Yet in the public controversy over the bishops, Milton had to leave a calm and pleasing solitariness to embark in a troubled sea of noises and hoarse disputes. When he surveyed his life and its prospects at the reason of church government, civil war was still 8 or so months away. Turbulent as the public scene was, there was no reason to suppose that the crisis would not be resolved peaceably, after which he could expect to return to his poetic ambitions in a still time, free of the quarrels and noises that had been the background to the tracts of 1641-2. Yet if we move forward 12 years to 1654, we find in another prose writing by him another autobiographical passage which tells a very different story. He's written little poetry in the interim. Instead, he'd become famous for a work of prose, the Latin work Defensio, Defense of the English People in 1650, which vindicated to a continental audience the execution of Charles I the previous year. His tracts against bishops had pleaded for reform in religion. They had touched on the political conflict between king and parliament only in passing and in mostly conventional terms. They had given no indication of a desire to alter the constitution. But now he was justifying not merely the trial and execution of the king, but the abolition of kingship and the rule unique in English history of a republic, the regime for which Milton wrote the work. Defensio, written to win over the European opinion, which the coup of 1649 had shocked, was a sensation. When he published a sequel, Defensio Secunda, in 1654, he rejoiced to recall the triumph of the first work. The book of 1650 was written, he remembered, against medical advice when his eyes were failing. He decided that as the use of light would be allowed to me for so short a time, it ought to be enjoyed with the greatest possible utility to the public. That utility now lay in prose, not in verse. In his sonnet in or around 1655 to Mr. Cyriac Skinner upon his Milton's blindness, he answers the rhetorical question, what supports me in his affliction? His answer is his knowledge that he's lost his eyes in liberty's defense, my noble task of which all Europe talks from side to side. In the autobiographical passage of 1642, Milton had explained what he expected to be a temporary diversion into prose from his poetic career. The autobiographical passage of 1654 which supplies the background to Defensio, gives no indication that Milton has ever written poetry or that he ever will. The achievement of his Latin prose has become the central feature of his life. Before the convulsions of the 1640s and 1650s, Milton is a writer of verse. So is he after them in the era after the Restoration, when he publishes the larger poems Paradise Lost, Samson Agonistes, Paradise Regained. But during the convulsed decades, he wrote mostly prose. The tracts against the bishops in 1641-2, the pamphlets on the divorce laws, on education, and on the freedom of the press in 1643-6. Then, after a 3-year gap, the treatises of 1649-55 in defense of the rulers who were brought to power by the execution of Charles I and in vindication of Milton's own praises of them. And then, after another gap, the succession of tracts of 1659-60 that were intended to rescue a disintegrating cause and stave off the Restoration. Now, the contrast between his commitment to verse on either side of the civil wars and his writing of prose during it is not absolute. There's a handful of Restoration prose works, though they've never compared in interest to the verse. He produced poems, almost all of them short, in the 1640s and 1650s, though at a rate that makes Philip Larkin seem prolific. But their subject matter is taken as his prose is from the world immediately around him. It doesn't move as his great late poems do and as their classical models do, beyond the author's time and place. I don't mean that Milton had lost his poetic vocation. When he announced the vocation in 1652, he warned that its fulfillment would take time, and he asked his readers for patience. The studies that he took to be essential to his poetic ambitions continued, and he began to write Paradise Lost in or around 1658, when the Puritan upheaval persisted, though we don't know whether he set the poem aside during the burst of pamphleteering in the year before the Restoration. Even so, the transformation of Milton's literary career by the upheaval of the 1640s and 1650s is startling. Yet how hard it's been to relate the career to those convulsive events. There have been two reasons for the difficulty. The first was the intense anti-Republican and anti-Puritan reaction that followed the restoration of the monarchy and the Church of England in 1660 and persisted to the 19th century. Plenty of people in that time admired Milton's poetry, but were dismayed by his politics. So his literary merits became separated from the views they expressed, and what he said got less attention than the way he said it. Dr. Johnson knew stretches of Paradise Lost by heart, but was revolted by Milton's political tracts. Actually, the separation of style from content began in Milton's own time. The continental readers, who were horrified by his political opinions, acknowledged with wonder the glories of the Latin prose, which voiced them. The second reason lies in the practices and frontiers of the modern academic world, which has separated England from history. For a long time, especially in the middle third of the 20th century, it was the norm for critics to disdain the banality of historical fact, which the literary imagination transcends. Milton, in adapting to a rapidly changing world, was often inconsistent, but everything he wrote in verse and prose alike was meant to affect that world. We can't grasp the themes and purposes that permeate his writings without attention to the historical setting which he tried to change. Many critics are now friendlier to history and in fact take more interest in it than most historians do in poetry. But the establishment of the relationship of text to context is still inhibited by competing disciplinary priorities. The effects of the events of the 1640s and 1650s on Milton's thinking and writing remain underappreciated. Of course, there's been a tradition favorable to Milton's politics too. In recent decades, it's resurfaced in literary criticism. Some influential late 17th and 18th century writers, albeit against the current, hailed his defenses of the regicide, though there was broader support for the plea of Areopagitica freedom of the press, which had become a less contentious subject. In that tradition, Milton has been saluted as a friend to liberty, pioneer of modern freedom. Liberty is indeed as central a concern as any in his writings, but his use of the word took forms incompatible with modern liberalism. Milton's conception of liberty remained constant in principle, even if his prescriptions for its achievement varied according to circumstance. Let me try to summarize it before I move to the changes of circumstance and to the developments and alterations of his perspective over the revolutionary decades. To Milton, liberty is an internal condition to be achieved within the mind and soul and through the discipline of emotional and moral self-government. It's not to be confused with, indeed is the opposite of, license, the freedom to sin. He uses the old term Christian liberty, which meant the freedom bought by Christ from bondage to sin. We become free when we cease to be slaves within, slaves, that is, to our passions and vices. Love virtue exhorts the end of Combes, for she alone is free. None can love freedom heartily, he explained in 1649, but good men. Around him he sees a degenerate nation, brought low in mind and spirit. Idolatrous and superstitious practices in the church have separated the nation from the truths of the gospel. Drunkenness, gluttony, boredom are the outward signs of inward rot and derive from slavery of the spirit. In 1641-2, Milton blames the degeneracy on bishops. During the Civil War of 1642-6, he finds new targets. His choice of them makes him an eccentric figure among the supporters of Parliament. Spokesmen for the parliamentarian cause made claims for the constitutional rights of Parliament, which they saw as necessary bulwarks against regal tyranny. Milton was not interested in such questions. To him, there was no point in constitutional or political programs which left the spiritual and moral condition of the nation untouched. For in his mind, tyranny, which makes us servile and unfit for the challenge of liberty, thrives on degeneracy and sinfulness. When he explains that only good men can love liberty, he observes that people who are slaves to their passions, being slaves within, naturally strive to have the public state conformably governed to the inward vicious rule by which they govern themselves. If, on the other hand, spiritual and moral health could be restored, political health would return as a matter of course. As he says in The Reason of Church Government, once the minds and spirits of a nation are set free from the thraldom of sin and superstition, all honest and legal freedom of civil life cannot long be absent. Once the Civil War in England had started, Milton concentrated on subjects which had no obvious connection to the parliamentary cause, but which to him were the keys to its recovery. His divorce tracts aroused a tremendous amount of hostility, but earned little support. The tracts on education and the press were little noticed. His focus was not on the immediate issues of the Civil War, which held the public's attention, but on the nation's underlying problems, which, if they were not addressed, would persist whichever side won the battle. He demanded the reform of schools and universities because it was for want of education that this nation perishes. For its salvation, England needed men inflamed with the study of learning, the admiration of virtue, a hopeless prospect at present in the universities, which had been poisoned by the bishops. Milton's preoccupation with the divorce laws was related to his own matrimonial difficulties, but it had a national theme. There was no hope of true reformation in the state, he maintained, so long as marriage partners were dispirited, driven to sinful thoughts by the household unhappiness of the divorce laws. The bondage of unhappy marriage made men unserviceable and spiritless to the common and unactive to all public service. Reformation requires not only spiritual self-command, but inquiry of the mind, which is learning's province. A degenerate people is at the mercy of custom, which produces not only the imitation of unhealthy social practices, but adherence to received ideas, a habit which creates a muddy pool of conformity and tradition. There are legal constraints on freedom of mind, too, the curbs imposed by enemies to truth, which Milton assails in Areopagitica. Cumulatively, those inhibitions induce men to believe as the church believes or as the state believes. Milton's own strenuous inquiries into theology and church history took him to positions of extreme radicalism, among them the repudiation of the doctrine of the Trinity and the heresy of mortalism, the claim that the soul sleeps after death. Too dangerous to be published, those heresies appear in his long private manuscript, De Doctrina Christiana, the Christian Doctrine, which he called my best and dearest possession. Areopagitica broaches another subject central to Milton's conception of liberty. Liberty is a heavy responsibility for whose discharge we are accountable to our Maker. We may be helped by good teachers or rules or hindered by bad ones, but ultimately we're on our own. God tests us in the choices we make and gives us free will in the making of them. The parliamentarian cause was tied to Calvinist theology, which asserted the doctrine of predestination. Again, Milton was an eccentric parliamentarian. Briefly in Areopagitica, at length in Paradise Lost, he refutes the doctrine of predestination and insists that God gave Adam freedom to choose, so that he fell freely and deserved his punishment. But man-made restrictions on belief or worship, by the bishops or by the curbing of the press attacks in Areopagitica, restrain or distort our choices and threaten the lifeline of our salvation. Because of Adam's sin, we live in a fallen world, where the Calvinism favored by Parliament emphasized the helplessness of human depravity. Milton's God allows us a way back, or at least partially back. We can repair the ruins left by our first parents, but only by right choices between good and evil. God tests us through trials and temptations, those lonely moments where the decisive choices of our lives are made, and when, if we pass them, we are purified. There's the temptation of the lady in Comus, which are chastity and calm. Milton chooses temptation for the theme of his great late poem. Paradise Lost turns on Satan's successful temptation of Eve, Paradise Regained for his unsuccessful temptation of Christ, who, by vanquishing temptation, has regained lost paradise. Samson brings disaster on the Israelites by yielding to the temptation of Delilah, but delivers it after withstanding her second attempt. In the Civil War, Milton is not only an eccentric parliamentarian, he's a lukewarm one, if he's a parliamentarian at all. But what would be gained by the victory of a body which reimposed curbs on the press, which left the divorce laws intact and education unreformed, and which, when all too slowly, it abolished episcopacy, and even then not from conviction, but only to persuade the Scots to enter the war on Parliament's side, replaced it with another national system of religious compulsion, Presbyterianism, the system he described as prelacy, writ large, for it was still more insistent on doctrinal uniformity than the bishops had been. The slavish imprint which the bishops had left upon our necks persisted. Milton wrote next to nothing about the war effort, about the battles which won it, even about the surge of civic cooperation around him, which in 1643 sent out a proud London force to the relief of Gloucester. Instead, when London was endangered by a royalist army early in the war, he wrote a poem urging the prospective invaders to spare his house. Lift not thy spear against the Muses' power. When 5 years later he wrote to a literary friend in Italy, he gave as a reason for his long silence the extremely turbulent state of our Britain, which quickly compelled me to turn my mind from my studies to protecting life and property in any way I could. Do you think there can be any safer retreat for literary leisure among so many civil battles, so much slaughter, flight, and pillaging of goods? The year of Parliament's victory, 1646, elicits from Milton not a paean to its triumph, but his melancholy sonnet on the new church system, which aspires to force our consciences with Christ set free. Milton has lost hope of the parliamentary cause. The next 2 years were a time of stalemate among the contending parties, when nothing was achieved except the entrenchment of Presbyterians. In the high hopes of May 1641, when it had seemed that England's political and religious problems might be resolved by royal concessions to Parliament's demands, Milton had saluted England as God's chosen nation, which the impending Reformation would redeem from the degeneracy and thraldom imposed by the bishops. Those hopes lapsed. The Milton sense of national degeneracy was added the aura of corruption surrounding the victorious Parliament. In 1648 came the Second Civil War, briefer but more vicious than the first. During it, Milton wrote a poem to the Lord General of the New Model Army, Sir Thomas Fairfax. What can war but endless war still breed, asked the poem, till truth and right from violence be free, and public faith cleared from the shameful brand of public fraud. In vain doth valor bleed, while avarice and rapine share the land. There had been civil wars in England before, but they'd been either quarrels over the occupation of the throne or contests between kings and barons. They weren't challenges to institutions, and they did not bring them down. The convulsions of the civil wars were unprecedented. It was obvious to Milton, as to so many, that a divine purpose must be shaping them. In 1641, he even thought them a prelude to the second coming. Although that millenarian vision retreated, he was certain that the nation was on trial. It too faced divinely appointed choices and temptations. Only once during the Civil War does Milton's pessimism about its condition lift. In Areopagitica, he decides that the English are in good plight, not degenerated, not drooping to a fatal decay, but casting off the old and wrinkled skin of corruption to outlive those pangs and wax young again, entering the glorious ways of truth and prosperous virtue. As at other moments in his life, the image of Samson comes before him. He thinks, I see a mighty and puissant nation rousing herself like a strong man after sleep and shaking her invincible locks. Freedom of the press is particularly necessary at a time when God appears to be decreeing to begin some new and great period in his church and revealing himself as he'd done in the time of Wycliffe, first to his Englishmen. While Presbyterians took fright at the spread of religious sects and of what they deemed heresies, Milton regarded the tumble of adventurous opinions produced by the Civil War as evidence of the advance of God's word. Behold now this vast city of London, he wrote in Areopagitica, and the pens and heads there, sitting by their studious lamps, musing, searching, revolving new notions and ideas, wherewith to present, as with their homage and fealty, the approaching Reformation. Others as fast reading, trying all things, assenting to the force of reason and convincement. How distant that optimism is from the Milton of the later 1640s. In 1647-8, Milton is in public almost silent. He's writing nonetheless, but writing in a genre far removed from his earlier compositions. He's embarked on a prose history of Britain, which he intended to bring down to the present day, but which didn't reach the Norman conquest. Historical writing is a new departure for him, and it produces a new voice. Milton's earlier prose, like his poetry, flies and soars. The prose of the history of Britain is deliberately plain and flat. The history has painful truths to tell, which must be bluntly expressed and grasped, and which Milton will not obscure with rhetorical flourishes. The history of Britain is no academic exercise. Like all Milton's writings, it's for present-day use. It's an examination of the nation's character as illustrated by the patterns of its history. He wants to know what kinds of men the Britons generally are, and whether they're fitted for momentous events. For if it be a high point of wisdom in every private man, much more is it in a nation to know itself. He dwells on a parallel between the condition of the Britons when the departure of the occupying Romans left the native population to the sway of their own councils, and that of today's Englishmen who defeated Charles I and have their destiny in their own hands. Before their opportunity, the Britons, like the English of Milton's time, had through subjection become servile. When emancipation came, they were at first greedy of change and wanted to be thought, as Milton had thought of the English of 1641, the leading nation of freedom. Some of them adored the name of liberty. Yet so soon as they felt proof by proof the weight of what it was to govern well themselves, and what was wanting within them, not the love of license, but the wisdom, the virtue, the labor to use and maintain true liberty, they soon remitted their heat and shrunk wretchedly under the burden of their own liberty. Milton wrote a digression to the history in which he set out the resemblances between the ancient Britons and the long colony. The date of the digression is uncertain, but the document conforms to the views Milton expressed in the main body of the history in 1647 to 8. In the early 1640s, Milton had hailed the deliverance brought by the Parliament. Now MPs have succumbed to the corruption on which Milton also touched in 1648 in his poem to Fairfax. Thus explains the digression. They who but of late were extolled as great deliverers and had a people wholly at their devotion, did not only weaken and unfit themselves to be dispensers of what liberty they pretended, but unfitted also the people, grown worse and more disordered, to receive or digest any liberty at all. And then, in the winter of 1648 to 9, comes the unexpected and astonishing fresh deliverance. It comes not from Parliament, but from the army which Fairfax led. In the peace negotiations of 1646 to 8, King and Parliament had sought compromises which, from Milton's perspective, would solve none of the nation's problems and would leave the persecution favoured by Baptists and Presbyterians alike in place. The nation was exhausted by the destruction of the war. In 1648, a great surge of public opinion demanded an end to the commons and the restoration of the king. The movement expressed in a series of provincial uprisings, which the new model army suppressed in the Second Civil War. The army won the war but could not prevent the continuance of the peace negotiations. In December 1648, Parliament was ready to endorse a deal with the king. It was prevented by the new model, which marched on London and forcibly purged a majority of the Commons, and so thwarted the plans of Royalists and Presbyterians alike. The remnants of the Commons, where the majority of constituencies were not represented, and a majority of the seats consequently empty, became derisively known as the Rump. In January, the Rump arranged the trial and execution of the king. In March, it abolished the office of a king and the House of Lords. In May, England was proclaimed a Commonwealth and free state. The Rump would remain in power for 4 more years. To Milton, the execution of the king, carried out at a moment when the Commonwealth nigh perishes, was a glorious, heroic, matchless deed, carried out to the renown and everlasting glory of the English nation, with such a resolution as we hardly find like recorded in any history. It was the achievement of the invincible army, which in the Second Civil War of 1648 had achieved such glorious deeds. The new model, he observed, was distinguished from other armies by its valor, its discipline, its avoidance of plunder, its sobriety, its godliness. The regicide was effected by the guardians of justice in martial uniform. Milton is never further from the liberal tradition which has adopted him than his ardor for the regicide. It didn't trouble him that the armed coup and the revolutionary deeds which it enabled were blatant affronts to the law of which the Parliament had seen itself as the champion against the king's breaches of it. To Milton, there were times in which this was won when the letter of the law was yielded to the spirit of justice. He wasn't troubled by the violence that excluded the majority of MPs, who he thought deserved what came to them. In Milton's eyes, the virtuous are essentially few. He scorns the opinions of majorities unless they happen to be right as they were. Milton portrayed the regicide as the achievement of the English people, but only of the good part of the English people, and the only part which deserves to be represented in Parliament. But the real representatives of the people in 1649 were the soldiers who formed at once the citizen army and the godly one. The regicide transformed Milton's life and writing. Hitherto, politics had been to him of secondary interest, not only because they could achieve nothing without moral reform, but because the civil immunities or liberty for which Parliament was contending, and which to him were far inferior in importance to the religious cause, didn't seem to him worth the price of a civil war. In 1641-2, he'd looked forward once the destabilizing influence of the bishops who seek to enthrall our civil liberty were removed, to the return of harmonious politics under the king. But in the surge of royalism in 1648, he saw a religious and a political evil combined. The people, he decided, being exorbitant and excessive in all their motions, were prone not to a religious only, but to a civil kind of idolatry in idolizing the king. Tyranny in the church and tyranny in the state had, he concluded, very dark roots which twine and interweave. The principal subject of Milton's prose had become not church government, not moral or spiritual reform, but the justification and merits of England's change of government. Not only had his writing changed, so had his career. Until 1649, he lived privately, perhaps subsidizing his studies by teaching. Yet soon after the execution of the king, he was suddenly given the post of Latin secretary or secretary for foreign tongues for the new regime. In that capacity, he was a civil servant, not a policymaker, but he also became a propagandist, not only in his tracts of 1649-50, but in collaborating with the journalist Marchmont Needham on the weekly news book Mercurius Politicus, which attacked royalists and Presbyterians with a merry and shameless indifference to factual truth. Milton liked to project himself as a grave and solitary figure above the fray, but he was a companionable man with a biting wit, characteristics he shared with his close friend, the jocular Needham, the serial turncoat, who wrote for and against all the various parties, except the Presbyterians, who Milton detested. How had Milton, an obscure figure save for the notoriety attracted by his divorce tracts, abruptly acquired so prominent a position in national life? It's easy to guess. Like Needham, Milton was a warm friend and admirer of the lawyer John Bradshaw, who presided over the trial of Charles I and then became president of the Republic's Council of State. He was Needham's patron and perhaps got to know Milton too. Milton lauded Bradshaw in extravagant terms, even after Bradshaw had fallen from power. But his relationship with Bradshaw presented him with a dilemma. From the start, the members of the new Republican regime were torn between two policies. There were those, Bradshaw at their head, who rejoiced in the memory of the regicide and wanted no compromise with its opponents. That was the stance favored by Milton's propaganda, which represented the abolition of kingship as the first stage of a European renunciation. But in the remnant of the Long Parliament was another. Some members had supported the regicide reluctantly as the only way out of the crisis of 1648-9. Others, a large number, had opposed it, but had found ways of keeping the seats. Such men wanted to put the regicide behind them and to reach out to the moderates who had been driven from power. They found their principal ally in Bradshaw's rival in the direction of the regime, Oliver Cromwell. It was Cromwell who steered through the regicide, but he also wanted to make the base of the new regime as broad as possible. Cromwell and Milton are often seen as partners, as the happy combination of the Revolution's leading statesman and leading poet. The Victorians went to town on the subject. They described Milton as Cromwell's personal secretary, living under his roof and sitting every day at the same table, where the two men hammered out Cromwell's foreign policy. Paintings and prints showed Milton playing the organ for Cromwell, who is wrapped in spiritual communion with him by the poet's playing. In reality, there's no evidence that the two men were alone together, and nothing to tell us what, if anything, Cromwell thought about Milton. There's a lot to tell us what Milton thought about Cromwell, who dominated the politics of the 1650s and who often dominated Milton's writings, but the thoughts were complicated. Milton had every reason to be grateful to Cromwell. What could have become of Milton's cause had Cromwell not moulded the new model army on the victories of 1648 to 51, which Milton's sonnet to him, our chief of men, in 1652, salutes? In a remarkable feat of balance and economy, all that is great about Cromwell is concentrated into 6 words of the sonnet: faith, matchless fortitude, peace, truth, glorious. But the poem is not confined to praise. Its later part moves from congratulation on the past to the challenges of the future. Peace hath her victories, no less renowned than war. Milton has one challenge particularly in mind. At the time when the poem was written, the Parliament was debating proposals drawn up at Cromwell's instigation for religious reform and for liberty of conscience. Liberty of conscience was the abiding preoccupation of Cromwell's political career, but his conception of it was not. Milton had come to believe in the total separation of church from state and in unlimited freedom of the religious sects. Cromwell did not. He wanted the state to control the ministry and to lay down limits to freedom of conscience. So Milton's poem warns Cromwell against the new foes which arise, threatening to bind our soul with secular chains. The threat was of immediate concern to Milton, who had recently been in trouble for enabling the publication of a work which espoused the most daring and dangerous of current heresies, denial of the Trinity, a position which Cromwell's proposals of 1652 would have prescribed. Around the same time, Milton wrote a sonnet to another leading MP, Sir Henry Vane, who'd been Cromwell's principal parliamentary ally in the 1640s, but who'd soon break with him. Vane was one of the few MPs to share Milton's commitment to the separation of church from state. Milton's sonnet to him applauds Vane's commitment to that principle. It doesn't venture to warn him, as the sonnet to Cromwell was Oliver, because unlike Cromwell, Vane has nothing to fear. Still, Cromwell was a better friend to liberty of conscience than the rather MPs, who saw off even Cromwell's proposals for religious reform. Although Milton publicly hailed the Parliament which had endorsed the regicide, he had little, if any, more fondness for it than he had had before its purge in 1648. He still regarded it as corrupt. In April 1653, Cromwell, who 4 years earlier had destroyed one side of the civil war, King, destroyed the other, the Long Parliament. In another exercise of armed force, he brought his musketeers into the chamber, expelled the members, and locked the door. Bradshaw, a resolute defender of civilian rule, who was evicted now from power, was furious. Milton supported Cromwell. 8 months later, after another military coup, Cromwell made himself Lord Protector. After the regicide, the Parliament had outlawed government by any single ruler, yet now Cromwell had become semi-king. That was not in itself an offence in Milton's mind. Milton was not, though he later become, a dogmatic republican. His enemy, he repeatedly said, was not kingship, but tyranny, which was its opposite. If you could only get the right king, as admittedly a rare but not an unknown event, kingship could be a greater power for good, for the rule of men. He subscribed to the Greek idea that excellence in virtue deserves supreme power, and for the time he hoped that Cromwell's rule would illustrate that principle. In any case, Milton thought that the suitability of forms of government mattered less than their spirit, that they should vary according to circumstances, and that nations were free to choose and change their forms of government as suited them. After the expulsion of the Long Parliament, the nation had teetered on the brink of anarchy, which the unifying power of a single ruler seemed the likeliest means of averting. It also seemed the likeliest hope of rallying the nation against that permanently a royalist invasion. There was a more positive argument for kingship. If we could only get the right king. Milton continued to work as Latin secretary under Cromwell, though he still yearned for the separation of church and state, and as in 1641-2 was impatient with the delay of reform. But there was another question about Cromwell, a question about not his views, but his character. Cromwell inspired universal mistrust. Allies who broke with him and leaders of the Commonwealth regime whom he evicted from power, Bradshaw among them, regarded him as a usurper and a hypocrite who'd sacrificed the parliamentary or godly cause to his own ambition. In Milton's writing, Cromwell faces a test of virtue. Like the lady in Comus, like Adam, like Samson, like Christ in the wilderness, he confronts the trial of temptation. For only by trials against vice is virtue formed and proved. Milton had already declared that the signers of Charles I's death warrant, whom Cromwell was one, had passed a trial of virtue, fair and glorious. What of Cromwell's subsequent record? Might he not have been prompted to expel the Long Parliament, not by the needs of God's cause, but by secret ambition? In 1654, 6 months after Cromwell's assumption of protectorate, Milton addresses him in Defensio Secundum. You have taken upon you the heaviest burden, which will try you thoroughly. It will search you through and through and lay open your inmost soul. It will show what is the predominant disposition of your nature, what is your strength, what is your weight, whether there is indeed in you that living piety, that faith, justice, and moderation of mind, for which we thought that you above all others deserve by the will of God to be elevated to the sovereign dignity. The answer to Milton proved to be no. He turned against Cromwell as he turned against the Long Parliament. The disillusion was bitter. Having eulogized the Parliament in the early 1640s and having eulogized the creation of the Commonwealth in 1649-50, he wrote no apologia for protectorate. Having broken with Bradshaw in welcoming Cromwell's forcible expulsion of the Parliament in 1653, he now shared Bradshaw's sentiment. Milton didn't oppose Cromwell openly. He kept his head down and retained his government post. But he made his feelings plain after Cromwell's death in 1658. Milton longed for a sense of reform and urgency. Instead, the protectorate turned the clock back. Gradually, it moved towards the restoration of the ancient constitution of king, lords, and commons. Presbyterians and royalists were brought back into the fold. The reforms which the protectorate did achieve in the Puritanizing of the church were effected by the alliance of church and state that Milton had formed. In May 1659, after the brief protectorate of Richard Cromwell, the protectorate collapsed, and the remnant of the Long Parliament, the Rump, which Oliver had expelled 6 years earlier, returned to power. It did so by permission of the army, which repented its earlier action. But the relationship between Parliament and army was the fault line of the governments of the 1650s. The two needed each other, but could not learn to coexist. The Parliament, whose roots of public support were so narrow, could survive only with military protection. The army didn't seek military rule. It believed in parliaments, but could not find a parliament to its liking. On the fall of the protectorate, Milton returns to power, not as in the years after 1649 as a spokesman for the regime, but as in the early 1640s as a private citizen. His initial mistaken hope was that the Rump, which had previously refused his plea for the separation of church and state, would have learned its lesson and would agree to it. But in October 1659, he returned to the political reign. It was then that the army, which had restored the Rump in May, expelled it again. The Rump and the army shared a basic thing. Since 1647, the year it became a political force, the new model had championed the notion of parliamentary representation and accountability. With the levellers, the army demanded regular and frequent parliamentary elections. The Rump justified its tenure of power on the ground that the people were the origin of all just power, and that the Commons, as the people's representative, was entitled to dispense with both the king and the House of Lords, which had abolished alongside kingship. But the empty seats in the Commons mocked the claims of representation, and the Rump dreaded the prospect of confronting the electorate. From the autumn of 1659, there came a groundswell of demands, public demands, from the constituencies for an end to the situation, for a free and full parliament, that is, a parliament freely chosen, with all the elected members free to sit. The parliamentarian cause in the Civil War had not remotely been republican. It had wanted to restore kingship to health. The execution of the king and the abolition of kingship were unthinkable in the First Civil War and were the initiative only of a minority when it came. Even then, there was no plan for a new. What happened in 1649 was the removal of most of the ancient constitution, the king, the lords, the majority of the commons, but the preservation of what was left, the minority of MPs whom the army allowed to rule. In defending the new regime, Milton was embarrassed by that improvised solution. He looked back to the glorious commonwealths of Greece and Rome and thought that in England should have found a new form of government which imitated those ancient regimes. But Milton himself, who was no constitutional architect, never proposed a new model of government, and in the last year of the Revolution, he was scornful of those such as the political theorist James Harrington, who did. Instead, he found himself clinging to the rule of the minority parliament. In April 1653, he had supported the army's forcible expulsion of the Rhine. In October 1659, when the coup was repeated, he turned on the army, and especially on General John Lambert, the man who designed the Protectorate and had orchestrated the Royals' second overthrow. Milton saw in Lambert, who played no part in the regicide and seemed to Milton a scheming pragmatist, what he'd come to see in the different character of Oliver Cromwell, the secret ambition for personal power. The experience of the Protectorate has set Milton against the rule of any single person, whether royalist or parliamentarian. His contrast between kingship and tyranny was forgotten. They'd become the same. Lambert's coup collapsed and the rump returned. Milton acknowledged its imperfections, but called for it to rule in perpetuity. If there were elections, the electorate must be confined to men who would pledge not to seek the restoration of single rule. But beneath the failings of England's rulers, there was a deeper problem. In Milton's eyes, the civil wars had been a trial and test, not only of the individuals who were prominent in them, but of the English people. The bishops had unfitted them for virtue and so for rule. Repeatedly in the 1640s and 1650s, Milton asked himself whether their slavish instincts, their taste for idolatry, their moral degeneration, were merely the product of piratical rule or were ingrained. It was an exploration of that question that he'd written his history of Britain and compared England's present characteristics with its past one. Another historical parallel exercise. He remembered the error of the noble Brutus and Cassius, who felt themselves of spirit to free a nation, but considered not that the nation was not fit to be freed, while forgetting that despite the Romans' old justice and fortitude, which was made to rule, they became slaves to their own ambition and luxury. He returns to the parallel in the history of Britain, where he tells us that histories teach us that liberty sought out of season in a corrupt and degenerate age brought Rome itself into further slavery. As Milton witnessed the clamour for the restoration of the king in 1659-60, his assessment of the nation's character became ever more pessimistic. As the people were not fit for freedom, how could they be fit for election? In 1654, he warned the people of the dangers attendant on the privilege of returning whom you please to Parliament. What hope was there of virtuous rule, he asked, if you may elect the man, however unfit, who brought no votes with food and drink? In answer to the royalist charge that the purging of Parliament and the regicide had no electoral sanction, he asked, was the nod of the people to be waited for, on which to hang the issue of council so important? What indeed if the people had demanded that Charles should be restored to the kingdom? In 1660, Milton heaped scorn on the notion of successive parliaments, the phrase that had long been used to encapsulate the demand for regular and frequent elections. In early 1660, he warned against the licentious and unbridled democracy, the noise and shouting of rude knowledge that elections would bring. In April 1660, he watched the epidemic madness and the general defection of the misguided and abused multitude, hurrying the nation to the precipice of destruction that would bring back the king the following morning. So it was that Milton, to whom the principles of choice and free will were so important in other spheres, refused them in politics. He'd not lost sight of that. His writings on the free choices of Adam, Christ, Samson, Christ, real choices precisely because God had left them free, were to come. But in 1660, when the elections were eventually held, which brought down the Puritan cause, Milton watched in despair the nation choosing a captain back to Egypt. In 1648, the tide of royalism and its alliance with Presbyterianism had been thwarted by the regicide, that glorious act of justice achieved by the army. In 1660, when Milton had turned against the army, he was elected again. Milton had become a party of one, telling truths to which the nation's perverse inhabitants were deaf. In the twilight of the revolution, he, with all hazard, ventured what I thought my duty to speak in season and to forewarn my country in time. Hazard indeed, though the real risks, it turned out, had been taken in 1649 to 50, in the abuse he'd hurled at the memory of Charles I. In June 1660, the Commons, returned by the elections he'd opposed, condemned Defensio to be burned by the common hangman. Having gone into hiding in London in the summer, Milton was arrested and was threatened with the fate of those signatories of Charles I's death warrant who were hanged, drawn, and quartered after the trial was recalled in Samson Agonistes as unjust tribunal under change of times. To general surprise, Milton escaped them. It's a frightening thought that had it been imposed, we wouldn't have the three great late poems. But at least we might have a stronger sense of what their greatness hides from us, Milton's engagement with the political convulsions of his time.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Warden. As time is beginning to press, I fear that we shall have to cut out the question and answer session because the reception to die for is waiting for us, as many of you know, across the corridor in the matching saloon. So I just behoved me to ask Sir Alexander Graham to give the vote of thanks. Is he here?
I feel I'm sort of here under slight false pretenses. I am a mercer, and I have been trying to help Milton's Cottage to gain some funds. And therefore, it's wonderful to see so many of you here listening to this incredibly erudite lecture. It's not an easy subject, Milton, because he was a bit of an odd character, let's face it. And I think the professor here has clarified so much in what he's been saying. And I'm sure we'd all like to thank him very much. And could I, just on behalf of the Mercers Company, welcome you all here. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. But Professor, thank you so much.